Sociology Speaker Series. My name is Ken Kane, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and the organizer of this year's and last year's Speaker Series event. It's a real pleasure to introduce and welcome today's speaker, Dr. Leila Harris from the University of British Columbia. Before we start, I'd like to first acknowledge the land and territory upon which our university and city rests and benefits, and then let you know more about upcoming speakers before we get going. The University of Alberta is home to a diverse and welcoming community of over 1,000 Indigenous students from across the country, and Edmonton has the second largest Indigenous population of any city in Canada. We celebrate our Indigenous heritage, including the ancestral lands on which our university is located today. To acknowledge the traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, reaching beyond colonization and the establishment of European colonies, as well as its significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon this territory, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the land and other inhabitants today. And so we respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and Métis nations of Alberta Region 4, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Our department is involved in a number of activities and programs that go beyond this land acknowledgement to apply and incorporate decolonization, reconciliation, and indigenization into our sociological work. The theme of our speaker series is Nature and the Social, which broadly encompasses the many ways that the social science and humanities explore, understand, challenge, and practice the complex notion of nature. First, a little bit about upcoming events. The speaker series has collaborated with the Department of Sociology's Equity, Diversity, Inclusivity, and Decolonization and BIPOC-aligned initiatives to sponsor Dr. Afua Cooper from Dalhousie University. Dr. Cooper will be speaking on February 17th on A Triptych of Slavery, Enslavement and the Black Body on the Canadian Colonial Frontier. Then, Dr. Carrie Norgard from the University of Oregon will be speaking on March 4th about her environmental justice research with the Karuk tribe of the Klamath River in Northern California. Stay tuned for more details on these sociology speaker events. But today we're here for Dr. Leila Harris, who is a professor in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability and Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Harris will be presenting on human right to water and ongoing challenges, equity, uneven implementation, and shifting state-society relations. Leila Harris is a professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia, as I mentioned. She also serves as co-director for UBC's Program on Water Governance, is a member of the Environment and Development, Gender Equity, and Sustainability Perspectives Research Program, and is an associate of the Department of Geography and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC. Dr. Harris's work examines social, cultural, political, economic, institutional, and equity dimensions of environmental and resources issues. Her current research focuses on the intersection of environmental issues and equality and social difference, water governance shifts, for example, marketization and participatory governance, in addition to a range of water governance challenges important for Canadian context, such as First Nations water governance. Her current projects include a SSHRC-funded project on everyday access and governance of water in underserved areas of Cape Town, South Africa, and Accra, Ghana. Dr. Harris is also principal investigator for the SSHRC-funded International Waters Research and Training Network focused on water governance, equity, and resilience in the Global South. We'll have time for questions and discussion following Dr. Harris's talk. At that time, you can use the raised hand button next to your name to indicate that you have a question to ask, or you can use the chat function to ask a text-based question that Sarah Doro and I can present to Leila. Dr. Harris has kindly agreed us to record this talk, and we'll post a link to this recording on our Department of Sociology website. And so with that, I'd like to virtually welcome Dr. Harris to the University of Alberta and Department of Sociology's Speaker Series. Leila?
Thank you so much, Ken, and thanks to Sarah and others who had organized the initial talk and visit and also followed up with this talk. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm meeting you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories and occupied territories of the Musqueam and Coast Salish people in present day and otherwise known as Vancouver. So as Ken just mentioned, I have a couple projects that I'll be speaking to today, but primarily the last one, which is the multi-sided investigation of the human right to water and its uneven implementation, and particularly the equity dimensions. So let's just look at the last decade and a few key moments around the human right to water. This is an image of Pablo Salon, the Bolivian ambassador to the UN, who in 2010 gave a very stirring speech on the floor of the assembly, whereby he snapped his fingers 3 times to symbolize the amount of time it takes for another child to die of a preventable disease, including lack of access to water and sanitation. Soon after his talk, finally, after many decades of debate, the General Assembly voted to adopt the UN right to water and sanitation, and the floor erupted in cheers. A year later, 2011, in June, the Ghanaian government made the decision not to extend the contract of Avril, which was a public-private partnership that had operated to deliver water in Ghana for the previous 5 years as part of a loan conditionality from the international financial institutions. Here, as you might know, in the language around this effort and their decision not to renew the contract, there was discussions around the performance of the company and the idea that Ghanaians should be the one managing water for Ghanaians, not international interest. Here, 2014, this is an image from around Cape Town in the context of Philippi, which is a Black township outside of the city. But this well could have been anywhere across the country in South Africa, pretty much any time over the past decade. This was a particular protest where issues around sanitation were especially emphasized. People were very upset that there had been contractors making money off of their situation of lack of access to sufficient sanitation facilities in the community, and also the municipality's role and responsibility in that situation. So all of these issues are just little moments and instances that sort of highlight different dimensions around the politics of the human right to water and how it's sort of marching unevenly and being implemented unevenly in different sites. They also sort of suggest the sort of difficulties of this very basic goal that now is comprised in SDG 6 of ensuring access to water and sanitation for all by the year 2030. So along with many others in my research group and in the EDGES Collaborative in particular, we've been looking at different dimensions around water insecurity and questions around the human right to water, including not only what are the different policy dimensions of this, what are the legal dimensions, but also especially what are the experiences and lived dimensions of something like the goal that's seemingly as straightforward as ensuring water and sanitation for all. So let me just start by introducing a little bit of the debate around the human right to water as it's been manifest, especially in the literature over the same time period, approximately the last decade, just to set up the research that we've undertaken. So there are many countries, about 150, that have some formal recognition on the right to a healthy environment or the right to water and similar rights enshrined in the Constitution or as part of multi-regional agreements and treaties or national legislation. And I already mentioned the UN recognition as well in 2010. But there's been a lot of debate from critics about how effective this framework is as a policy and as a discourse. So there's been a round number of critiques that have come forward, and I'm sure especially those of you who are sociologists are more than familiar with some of these types of critiques. But it's been noted, for instance, that the fact that the human right to water is very state-centric is problematic. It's very Western-centric, individualistic. It's human-centered. It doesn't take adequate account for non-humans. The fact that it can be consistent with privatization or commodification agendas, all of these have sort of given people reason to pause and to be skeptical about this framework and whether or not it's something that we should be investing our political and policy energies in. So just to give you an example, the context of South Africa, where there is a constitutional guarantee for the right to water and sanitation in the Constitution, is often cited and pointed to in terms of to demonstrate why this is an insufficient or inadequate framework. So this is from Bakker, writing in the book from Sultana and Loftus on the human right to water. And here the argument that's sort of highlighted is that there's been little practical change on the ground. There's ongoing inequities. So therefore, this shows the inadequacy of the framework and the idea of the human right to water and the need to pursue other avenues. To respond to these sort of debates, we've done sort of conceptual work and also empirical work, both of which I'll address in today's talk. So working with the sociologist Oriol Morosa, early on, we started thinking about what are the potentials and limits of this framework and what can we say to sort of speak to these critiques. And I should also mention that Parmar and others have said in particular that because of these limitations and considerations, this framework is particularly inadequate when you're talking about marginalized or indigenous populations, is something that's been frequently or mentioned several times, including by Parmar. So to respond, Oriol and I have highlighted a couple things that I'll just summarize very briefly. One is that if we consider this debate in the context of the previous several decades, where there's been a big push, especially from neoliberal water governance, for this idea that we should be focused on efficiency, full cost recovery, and also privatization, that the human right to water sort of takes on a different hue or valence in this context. So particularly, to focus on equity rather than those goals of efficiency or full cost recovery is a particularly valuable counterweight to the way the discourse and policy frameworks had been moving prior to 2010, but just in the past several decades, in the 80s and 90s in particular. As well, to focus on the state actually takes a different hue also when you think about the way that state responsibility and state role had been shifting during that same time period with respect to neoliberalization agendas. So this sort of gives us a different way of thinking about what is the political and progressive significance of emphasizing state responsibility and state role in the context of rollback and shifting state responsibilities of the previous several decades. We've also sort of highlighted, and we believe that there's considerable aspirational value. So here, especially in the context again of neoliberalization, as Ferguson and Sneddon and others have argued, it's often posed as if there are no alternatives. So here, reframing around equity, focusing on the ends rather than the means, so moving away from how to deliver to what the consequences or outcomes are, and also having this aspirational element of achieving universal access consistent with the definition on the bottom of the screen has sort of considerable value that we have to take seriously. So just a few other considerations before I go to some of the empirical work. Other people have noted a number of other things that they'd like to see around the human right to water discussion. For instance, focusing on participation, focusing on productive uses and not only focusing on drinking water where there's been an overfocus, and recent conceptual work by the HWISE group, which I'm working on with several others, which is the Household Water and Security Experiences Network. Jepson has led this paper, and there's been a lot of interesting thinking just about not thinking about water and human right to water or water security in relation only to the water. Are we delivering water to people? But what are those broader notions of well-being that are served by water? And what are the broader ways in which social relationships and hydrosocial relationships might support water security? Again, not just focusing on the pipe or delivery, but thinking about the broader social context that enables or supports access to healthful or affordable water. This framework is part of what I'll be building on today in terms of thinking about the human right to water, not only in terms of what we need bodily, what do we need to drink to persist and exist and for our health to be maintained to tomorrow, but what are the social relations that are also served by things like access to water or quality of water? So what are the broader links between water security and emotion, ideas of equity, ideas of belonging, inclusion and exclusion? So this is the context I want to move towards with some of what I'll speak to today. So The project that was mentioned that I'll be drawing on primarily, even though I'll also draw on other work from some of my colleagues, is this project that we've been doing, this multi-sited work. It's a team effort that's been underway for almost a decade in Accra and Cape Town. We've done a number of different things as part of this project to sort of investigate these issues around the implementation of the human right to water, but also the narratives and meanings, and again, the social lives and political lives around these questions. So again, not treating it only as, are we delivering water, at the minimum amount to maintain human needs or bodily needs, but what are the broader social relationships or narratives that are enabled and served by these transitions or governance processes and other things that are observed as part of these discourses and practices. So this project has involved several postdocs, a series of master's projects and PhD projects, some in Cape Town, some in Accra, and a couple in both sites. And in terms of methods, we've used interviews, focus groups, we've done a survey, participatory video, and other approaches. So just to give you a quick sense of the context where this work has been carried out, these are the primary sites around Accra where we've done research, again, survey, participatory video, and qualitative work, even though there's been several other communities as well. And these are the primary sites in Cape Town. And in fact, we did survey work in Philippi and Kailicha. Philippi was the image that I showed you in the introduction. But all of our qualitative work and follow-up work, focus groups, interviews, and video work has been done in Kailicha solely. So I won't be able to go into any depth in terms of these contexts and what's going on specifically around water access and quality, but I'll just say one or two quick notes before we move on. And these are the things highlighted in bold. One is that situation in Accra of the private-public partnership with Avril that existed for 5 years until 2011. Another is in Accra for many years until very recently, there's been a shortage in the system. So only about half of the residents in Accra have been able to be supplied on a regular basis with the municipal water system. As a consequence, there's been a rationing schedule that's been used. So maybe your neighborhood might receive water 1 day a week as part of the rationing. And there's also heavy reliance, which continues today on vending and sachet and so forth. Linked to that, there are really important affordability challenges. So some of the early estimates that I had seen prior to undertaking this research were that as many as half of the residents in Accra are paying over a quarter of their income on water and other basic services, which is much more than the recommended 3 to 5% that one might expect. In Cape Town, associated with the constitutional right to water and incredible investments that have been made throughout the country, a lot of the numbers that Cape Town is able to boast are close to 97, 98% of people are served with basic water access. So this is something that would be often celebrated in terms of meeting the joint monitoring program sort of goals and expectations, and also the broader policy framework around the human right to water, such as that's discussed in the UN. That said, there is, of course, considerations, some of which will be touched on today, in terms of how the water sector continues to be shaped by apartheid legacies and planning policies. And as well, there's specific issues around how the human right to water is achieved, or how access is achieved, for instance, through the free basic water policy and associated technologies such as water metering devices. And these have all been emphasized in the literature and have come up in our work as well. So just to give you a quick portrait in terms of some of what we observed in some of the early work that we did in these sites, I'll mention as well that we purposely selected sites that are the most vulnerable or the least well served. So we're not trying to get a cross-section of these cities. We're actually targeting those communities that we expect are the least well served across these communities. So in these sites, just to give you a glimpse again, this is just from the survey that we undertook. And there's a couple of things that are notable. This is just representing 3 questions across both country sites. And here you'll see that's maybe a little bit surprising that over 90% of respondents in South Africa, for instance, agree that they have easy access to water and that the water that they get is of good quality. So that's actually surprising a little bit. And it's actually was a surprise by some activists that I showed this data to, but it's actually consistent with other survey that was also undertaken in similar township communities in the country. So pretty strong agreement that the water is good quality and easy to access. But you'll also know, and here I'm just again focused on the South Africa data, that there's a drop. So for some reason, satisfaction does not follow from easy, accessible, good water, good quality water. So something else is at play here in terms of what tracks and enables satisfaction in the community. You'll also see, of course, in general, there are lower degrees of positive responses in Ghana, and I won't speak to that, but we can talk about it, of course, in terms of the methodological or political implications of doing multi-sided work of this type, but I won't speak to it too directly. Just because I've done quite a bit of work on gender, and I know some of you have interest in gender, I just wanted to mention this briefly. We've done some analyses using, again, this survey data from 2012. And we were just looking, based on the literature on gender and water, are we observing some key differences in terms of male and female respondents? And to sum it up, the answer is not much. There's not much that came out of the testing that was statistically significant in terms of what we thought we'd see in terms of ease of access to water, quality of water, satisfaction, and other considerations. This was somewhat of a surprise to us, based on the literature, most qualitative, that really emphasizes key gender differences along these lines. That said, when we were sort of thinking about some of these results and trying to understand them, just to clarify, we were sort of realized that doesn't mean that gender is not key or operating, in that there might be very different assumptions or expectations about what is easy or what is satisfactory when you're speaking to male or female respondents in these contexts or in other contexts. And just to illustrate this, here's one of the questions where there was a statistically significant response between the male and female respondents. And this was around who fetches the water. So when we broke this down by male or female respondents, you might see some interesting trends here, which might feel familiar in terms of household dynamics and other things. But as example, if you ask females in Ghana who primarily fetches the water, 89% will tell you that it's mainly females that fetch the water. When you ask the men, they'll say 50% approximately are men who fetch the water. So this sort of just speaks to the different expectations and dynamics that might already be operating even before they respond to the question in terms of the different subjective understandings of some of those questions and how they might play out in the responses. So just returning more centrally to the human right question, as I said, a major goal of the project is to think through the experiences of these situations and how that is meaningful in people's lives. Again, beyond sort of bodily health or public health, what is the significance, meaning, or narratives that are attached to these issues around poor quality or unaffordable and other situations around the human right to water. So Lucy Rodina, who later finished with a PhD and has now moved on to work for the federal government, did this work as part of her master's degree at UBC. And working in Kailicha, this is just one example that emphasizes some of these issues around the everyday narratives and experiences around water access in these communities. So this is just an image of a tap. This would be a communal tap in Kailicha. This particular tap happens to be broken, but you can still get a sense of the context in terms of how these are situated. You can also get a sense of, in this case, the shack dwellers, the types of homes that exist in the settlement. And the settlement would be a mix of these, which are called shacks, or RDP homes, which would be formal homes built by government sources. So it would be a mix of both of these homes in a settlement like Kailicha. And this is Site C in particular. Kailicha is enormous. It's over 1 million people, a sprawling settlement that goes over sand dunes pretty much all the way to the ocean. So it's a huge community. So this is from one of the interviews, just in terms of talking about this situation of accessing water through communal taps of that type. So in the center here, or towards the bottom, you'll just see this sort of sense about what this experience is like. So we are fetching water from that pipe. So children come and play there. Other people come to do their laundries there. Others come to do their dishes. So it's filthy. It's not clean, not hygienic, so it's bad. This again is just an example about what is it. Yes, people are accessing water. You see the 97% of people in Cape Town have access of water near their home. In fact, people in Site C are not paying for water, so it's free of charge at present. But there's still issues and considerations in terms of their satisfaction and the suitability of that water source. This is another example from work that Lucy also led in this context. And here it's about how people narrate issues of belonging or ideas of social political difference in and through their relationship with these infrastructures or differentiated access to services. So again, just to move towards the middle where I have it in bold, this respondent, who's a shack dweller in his late 20s, I believe it says, yes, 30s, says, "We are not the same. We do not have the same rights. Some people are staying in good houses," here referring to the RDP homes, "in beautiful houses which have been built with good conditions. Other people are still staying in the shacks." And this divide or this gradient in terms of housing, which also means you have access to an in-home tap and toilet versus people who are relying on the communal tap and toilets, is a huge divide in these communities. And it's often was narrated to us in terms of one of the key things that distinguishes members of the community. This also was spoken about in terms of political implications of this. So it became a very key dimension of how people talked about their own responsibility as citizens. So here you might notice he ends with, how can we, the shack dwellers, pay for water? So questions around affordability, who should pay for water, who has access to it, what water sharing looks like, or even, as I'll get to, how people talked about the state and the legitimacy of the state and its role around water was very much divided in terms of whether or not one was engaging in access to water through the communal taps and shared toilets or the in-home tap and toilet in the RDP homes. So I'll shift now to this theme of the state, which is the key thing that I wanted to emphasize today in terms of some of these broader social and political issues that circulate around water access or infrastructure or access to services. So this became a key theme I focused a lot on in my earlier work from southeastern Turkey. And this was work in the Kurdish region of Turkey. So as you can imagine, really important implications in terms of how people talk about and respond to state efforts or state-led development in this case. And what sort of surprised me and what was unexpected was how much people narrated and attached ideas of state legitimacy to their specific relationship to irrigation infrastructure and water services, a little bit again in this context as well, but mainly irrigation. And a lot of what people said was about how the state, they had a different relationship to the state that was forged through their changing relationship to water, through ongoing delivery and projects that were unfolding in the region as I did this study. So this is a theme that's been picked up and highlighted in other work on political ecology of the state, the resource state nexus, and the terminology of bridge here. And this was, again, something we revisited in the work on everyday water access and services in these underserved settlements and communities in Ghana and South Africa. So again, I'm highlighting Lucy's work here. She focused on, again, the way in which ideas of marginality, as we emphasized in relationship to shack dwellers or housing, were really important to how people talked about their state and their relationship and whether or not they felt represented or whether or not they felt it was appropriate for them to have to pay as consumers of water in these communities. The other thing that we did is we tested whether or not there was a relationship in both country contexts, so Ghana and South Africa, between the quality of water, ease of access to water, and satisfaction with trust in government. And here, maybe it's not surprising, but this is something I'd like to emphasize and think about a little bit. is we did find that trust in government was linked with water services in South Africa, but we didn't find the relationship in Ghana. As well, in South Africa, we found that trust in government was linked with water quality, the perceived water quality as reported, and satisfaction, but not with access. So this was sort of interesting to then puzzle through and to try and think about what was going on here and what we were observing. So again, just to remind you, well over sticking with South Africa as part of the story around trust in government, well, over 90% said the water is easy to access, the water is of good quality. It went to 60 some percent that were satisfied with the services, which is still not that bad, especially if you've been following the context in South Africa. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been huge protests over the past decade around service delivery. So again, emphasizing water, but also especially sanitation and some other issues around housing, electricity, and so forth. So this is just an image that's sort of compiling different databases around these community protests. And notable again is that they've been recurrent throughout the last decade, decade and a half, and they've been throughout the country. So not just in Cape Town, but throughout South Africa. And they've been occurring in all different types of settlements all over the country. So let's just sort of sum up and look at some of these puzzles that we have here that we want to think through in terms of analytically what this might mean or what we could learn from these examples. So the first is that basic point that satisfaction doesn't seem to track ease of access and quality of water, even though we would think from a human right to water perspective or basic water access that those would be fundamental. We find that trust in government is linked with these water conditions in South Africa, but not in Ghana. And again, we find that it's linked in terms of quality and satisfaction, but not ease of access. And we have sort of strong agreement, even in the least well-served settlements, that their water is good and easy to access, but there's very high politicization. So what can we pick apart here to try and understand some of these puzzles that I've tried to lay out? So basically, I think the things that are happening here, again, are pretty straightforward, but are interesting to sort of disentangle and try and think through. So the first is just the way in which the human right to water is never a sort of universal, even though we often talk about it in that way because we think about universal access, but it's always variegated and articulating with specific geoinstitutional histories, cultures, and other differences. So I really think a key dimension of the human right to water is to really think through how this plays out and is implemented or unfolds or is contested in particular context, rather than thinking about it in broad terms, which maybe we had the tendency to do because of the definition. Another thing that is happening here is we see this geoinstitutional history in South Africa coming forth in the data that I've reported. So there is a strong discourse with the human right to water in South Africa, precisely because of the constitutional guarantee that came with the new democratic South Africa in the mid-90s. It is a state-centered constitutional guarantee. So it's this idea that the state should deliver to all of its citizens these basic services, housing, electricity, water, and sanitation. So I think this is just reflected in our trust data. So in a sense, this analysis is more diagnostic than anything else, where you have this sense of the state and the legitimacy of the state or the state role is tightly tethered to whether or not one is satisfied with the services that one is getting in terms of water and other basic services. I haven't looked at sanitation, even though I'd be really curious to look at some of these other services and how it potentially is linked. But what's more is it wasn't just that there was a promise that everybody would have basic water, that no one would go thirsty, no one would become sick with poor quality water. The promise of the ANC, when the ANC came to power with the new democratic South Africa, was in fact that this would be equitable access to water and other basic services, and that equitable access to services would be a key pathway for redress, to redress the inequities of the apartheid era. So further, this sort of retrenches the idea that trust in government and legitimacy is a function or direct relation or outcome of whether or not people feel that the services that they're receiving in terms of basic goods like water are not only suitable, not only good quality water, but actually also equitable. And here's basically the rub. People who are uh, collecting water at no cost from a communal tap certainly have enough to do their laundry and are not going to go thirsty. And the water apparently is of good quality, as reported both by residents and the government. But it's not equitable. It's not the same as the people that they see in the nearby RDP homes. And it's certainly not the same as people who are living in the nice suburbs in Stellenbosch or in Rondebosch or other white communities with their swimming pools as well as their drinking water. So here again, we can think about how satisfaction doesn't track in terms of access in the basic services sense, but it's very much perhaps related to this idea of dignity, but also equity and relative inequity as people are observing their situation vis-a-vis their neighbors. And again, this also helps us to think through why are people getting the basic services that one would think they need, but it's still contested and heavily politicized. Again, this is a direct outcome of the promise that this would be equitable and that this would be the pathway for redress in a democratic South Africa. So as noted by anthropologists Redfield and Robbins, who work in South Africa, they say the very idea of democracy and rights and citizenship of South Africa have become tightly tethered to popular demands for access to basic state services, technologies, and infrastructure. So this is precisely the bundling that we're seeing in some of what we've observed both in the narratives and also in some of the statistical testing that I've addressed here. So returning to this idea of the HR human right to water, is it useful? One of the other critiques that I didn't mention at the beginning, but that's relevant here, is sociologist Leila has said, using data from South Africa, in fact, that because a lot of marginalized communities don't even know about the right, it shows that it's sort of ineffectual and doesn't mean much for people's everyday lives. I've tried to show, and I think that there's still reason to be cautious and to be careful for all the reasons that have been highlighted in terms of what a rights framework does or doesn't do. But there is also important promise. And I think that it does play out very importantly in people's everyday lives in ways that are meaningful, even if we're not always seeing the degree of change or meeting the expectations that might be there in terms of service access or water access in particular. I think highlighting some of these lived experiences are really important and helpful to think through this unevenness and what the consequences are beyond the basic assumption, which I think we can all share, that we know that people need water and sanitation to live a healthy life. But how else is this affecting people's experience, their life, their social networks, their relationships, political subjectivities, and so forth? And so I think getting at some of these lived experiences and daily dimensions can really help us think through and unpack some of those other significant dimensions. So whether it's around emotional lives or, again, social networks or other things that are affected, or senses of belonging, or whether or not someone feels like a second-class citizen. We can talk more in the Q&A, but that would be a very important dimension for Flint, Michigan, for example. How lack of access to safe water tracks and reinforces all the other dynamics that we see in terms of political contestation for something like Black Lives Matter and the other issues in terms of who counts and who belongs and who matters. So here again, just to sum up, I've tried to think through how we can analyze and think about some of these broader senses of well-being or broader relationships, the issues around social and political lives that might come to bear or matter for questions as basic as access to services such as water. And again, how this can impinge on things such as citizenship or subjectivity, which I haven't spoken to a lot, but we've also done some work on, or state-society relationships, as I tried to discuss with some of the examples around trust. So going back again to the HRW, I would say I agree with colleagues that it's probably necessary but insufficient to achieve our goals, such as those embedded in SDG 6. I would argue, along with Angel and Loftus, who have also similarly come to argue, that just talking about state centricity is not enough to discuss this as inadequate, but it actually, so it's not just a problem or limitation, but it's a question that requires critical analysis and interrogation. So what does this state centricity really mean? How does it track against other issues and concerns we might have in terms of different social and political agendas? And to sort of sum up, I would say there's also something that we haven't explored much with the human right to water, but I think there's some potential here to really recast or rethink some of our broader questions around human nature relationships, to go to the theme of the series, or our relationships to each other, in fact, in different and new ways. So we've talked about the human right to water in terms of the need to push it more towards productive uses, the need to think beyond drinking water and to engage with participation, for instance. But other discussions around water have pushed us in yet other ways that maybe could impinge on the human right to water as well. So of course we have work by Anishinaabe scholars such as Deb McGregor in Canada, who have talked about the different ontologies that are relevant for water, where we need to think about all of the social relationships and other connections that affect our relationship to water. In a similar way, the argument is made that water is a social good. And by this, we mean that just as education, we tend to accept that all of us are better off if everybody's educated, that we don't just want to reserve it for the few, that we're all served by having this for all people. Water similarly serves our health goals, but also other social goals by allowing everybody to be served. So we know COVID has made this very clear. Lack of access to water can both worsen the spread of COVID, but also intensify the outcomes for communities. And we can also think about it in other social ways as well. It's connected to access to education and other issues. So how can we move more towards this understanding of water as a social good, whereby we're all invested and we all benefit when everybody has access, instead of the idea of saving it for a segment of society? More philosophically, but I think also important, work by people such as Astrida Nemainis, and of course the indigenous philosophers and thinkers also have pushed us in important ways as well. But Astrida Nemainis talks about watery subjectivity. And I find this also useful just to sort of push ourselves to think differently in a way that water invites us to, about broader questions of social connections and networks. So what she says is very simply that all of our bodies are made up mostly of water. We're 70% or so water. Water moves through us. We're porous in a way that really disrupts this notion of a discrete body. Water moves through us, we drink it, we're affected by the waterways that we draw water from, and we also in turn affect those waterways. So she uses this reality around water in the way that it connects us to other people, but also ecologies and other beings, to ask us to think differently about our subjectivity and our relationships in a way, again, that I think mirrors some of the discussions around indigenous ontologies and relational ontologies. But here, how can we think instead about our connectivity to landscapes, ecosystems, and each other through this relationship to water and how it moves? And so just to close, sort of following up on this issue of connection and mutuality, this is the birthday week of Martin Luther King Jr. And so these are, again, broader social questions that debates around water, shifting understandings of water, can invite us to think about some of these webs of connections and mutuality differently. So he says, in a way that sort of mirrors what Nemanis is saying, we're all tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects us all indirectly. So I'd like to sort of close by inviting this sort of broader thinking around human right to water and what it might allow us to do. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Leila, for that wonderful talk. And I think